test is in the front office. If you want to go take that whenever you're able. I mean, you can do it right now if you want to, and just come back. Sure. Okay. Any questions from you guys before we start? Just as a reminder, first test is a week from today. Not first test. First paper is a week from today. So, if you haven't started that, you might want to. Again, the default topic is westward expansion, but you can talk about whatever. All right. Any questions from you guys before we start? Okay. So, we ended here. Oh, I left that on yesterday. Let's go run the battery out. With really the formation of the Populists, creating their own party, again, out of the Farmers' Alliances. So their initial run, again, it wasn't some blowout success, but the fact that they had anything was pretty good for a party that had just formed. So they came in third in the presidential election, had more than 1 million popular votes, 22 electoral votes, 10 congressional representatives, 5 senators, 3 governors, 1,500 state legislatures. So, again, not a bad start. And then we had these various images here. We had the debt, interest-bearing bonds, etc., that were really holding down the labor class. And then this whole push for like free coinage, which again, that's a whole thing, which unfortunately we're going to talk more about in a minute because it continues to be an issue. And then I had this here last time as well, this view of the Populists and how they were a bunch of different groups that came together to form this, quote, platform of lunacy, which is a little dramatic. But as we're going to see, once things start getting rocky, the group does pull itself apart. So, 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt, which, due to the interconnectedness of the various railroads, rather than it being a lot of little small ones, there was just a few big ones, caused a huge chain reaction. And a quarter of American railroads crashed by the end of the year, which completely wrecked the economy. Because, again, our economy was based on railroads at this point. Oops. May 5th, 1893, we had Black Friday with a stock market collapse. Europe had already been dealing with economic pressures, so they had been pulling investments out of the U.S., which further made it difficult for the banks to remain solvent. So when the banks crashed, it also hurt the farmers who had been using the banks for loans in order to run their farms. So, if you know anything about the Great Depression, this should sound very familiar. It's one event that triggers a series of chain reactions. Bleh, I can't speak. That just ends up running the whole economy into the ground, because our economy isn't as robust as some people would like to say. Also, Grover Cleveland made it worse, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So agitation among unemployed flared. There were a number of people, including the president himself, fearing that this could lead to another, quote, rebellion, which is to say they were worried that this depression was so bad that it would cause another civil war. So in the spring of 1894, Jacob Coxey, who was a populist in Ohio, marched from Ohio to Washington, and over the course of this march, more and more people joined up with him, so by the time he got to D.C., there was about 500 people. So, the point of this march was to, show the president and Congress that the people were desperate, and to essentially request a public works program so that the unemployed could have jobs, which A, would mean they would have money, but also B, would be pretty beneficial for the economy, because if nobody's working, nobody's making money, and nobody's buying stuff, which just makes the economy slump more. So this became known as Coxey's Army, and after they arrived in Washington, Coxey was turned away and then arrested for trespassing. So nothing came of this. However, again, if you're familiar with the Great Depression and like FDR stuff, this is basically what FDR ended up doing, was to create public works programs to just put people to work, even if a lot of it was not super necessary. Although a lot of the infrastructure we have today was built during the Great Depression because of this. So, yeah, Cleveland was basically given the best possible option, and he turned it away. So, while we don't really talk about the 1893 Depression, it was a big deal at the time. Again, we're used to, when we talk about economic crashes, it's the Great Depression. That's largely due to its tie-in with World War II, and it being the most recent of these extremely bad, granted we're kind of living through one, economic crashes. But one seemed to happen like every 30 years here in the U.S. And this was one of the worst. So you had this is a stage play that's talking about the concerns and problems of the average man during this, quote, war of wealth, as they called it. Here we have Coxey's Army. It was like 500 guys by the end of it, and they made their way into Washington to, again, request some kind of public works program. And because they were on the steps of the Capitol, or at least Coxey was arrested for trespassing. I don't know how many of these other guys were as well. And here again is a image of the group breaking camp. You've got, guys with instruments here, because they literally were playing marching music. You've got a dog, and that's always important for these sorts of things. This, and I swear it says Puck, this is the best one I can find. This just kind of shows the hyperbolic reaction to this, quote, army. Again, it was a dude and a bunch of poor people who wanted to be able to work. And the government responded a bit dramatically. And here you see them falling off a cliff in their reaction. Yeah, it's a whole thing. So, speaking of Cleveland, after dismissing and, again, arresting Coxey, Cleveland allowed the federal injunction and then the troops to go in and disperse the Pullman strike, which we talked about earlier this chapter. So obviously railroads and large businesses were behind this because, hey, the government's willing to send in troops to take care of our employee problems. It showed to the working class that the government was not going to do anything to help them. And in fact, at the start of Cleveland's term, which always prior to an economic crash, it's this time of great prosperity, He stated, while the people should patriotically and cheerfully support their government, its functions do not include the support of the people. Which is to say, the average person should support the government, but the government doesn't necessarily need to be there for the people. All right. I feel like we had a war over this. Then Cleveland had Congress repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which further endangered the livelihoods of the silver miners, because again, they needed to have the silver price high for them to make their money. It also hurt the farmers in the Great Plains and the South because they were drowning in debt, and again, expansion of currency causes inflation, which means that the money isn't worth as much as it was. But if you took out a loan in, say 1885, and then in 1892, there's this, or just a later year, there's inflation, then that amount of money that you owe doesn't hurt you as much, I guess is the easiest way to put it. But with this, it curtails the silver in the market, which causes deflation, which isn't necessarily a good thing either. I mean, we had a big inflation thing happen in the last couple of years, which was a problem. But deflation in the other direction is also bad. Also, removing the silver backing of the currency, which is a huge problem because that means that the money isn't guaranteed to be backed by silver in a bank somewhere, caused a lot of European investors to withdraw their gold from the U.S. Treasury, which just further exacerbated the Depression. So due to all of this, the government was about to go bankrupt. And in order to avoid that, Cleveland worked out a deal with a syndicate led by J.P. Morgan. Essentially, they would sell government bonds to these rich investors. And a government bond is basically you giving the government a loan. You buy these bonds, you give the government money, they give you a little piece of paper that says in X amount of years this will be worth this much more. Which meant that the investors essentially were making money and keeping the government afloat while the poor were just left in squalor. Needless to say, Cleveland is remembered as one of our worst presidents, right up there with Johnson. He did nothing for the people besides make things worse. Which again, I will slightly defend Cleveland in that up to this point the presidents hadn't really done much since, I would say Johnson, but Johnson got himself in trouble. So really since Lincoln, the presidents haven't really been important. So normally Cleveland could have been just as incompetent as he wanted to be and nothing would have happened. But since he had a major crisis on his hands, he didn't do a very good job. So, here we have senatorial courtesy. This is the silver miner owners. Let's see here, got a little thing in his pocket. Going on about how the silver prices need to remain high because it's in their best interest for that, and the rest of the Senate is either asleep or just covering their ears and ignoring them. Because, back in the day, the Senate used to be civil and full of decorum. I say, having known, I've told y'all that they used to have physical fights on the Senate floor. So, yeah. For some reason, this was a common depiction of Cleveland as this puppet master. Not really. He didn't quite have the political acumen for that. And here we have, out of the silver flood, Uncle Sam saving Columbia, which in this one says business interest, from the flood of silver. Because for certain people it was good, for most people it wasn't. But most people are poor, and therefore the government doesn't care. Okay, I want to mention this because we're going to see this again in later depictions. Who's familiar with the old Brothers Grimm tale, The Pied Piper? Is the Pied Piper seen as a positive character? No. Okay, so for those of you that aren't aware, story of the Pied Piper, this is, in some rural German village in like the 1500s. They're plagued with rats. You can't get rid of them. This guy comes through. He has a pipe, a flute, whatever you want to call it. And because, against the Grimm's tale, he's got magic. Just don't question it. And he can play this tune and basically hypnotize all the rats, and they'll follow him. And again, depending on the telling, he either leads them into the forest and they scatter, or, more often, leads them into the river to drown. And he agrees to do this for the town, but they need to pay him. I mean, he's an exterminator at this point. You gotta pay the guy taking care of the rats. So he does this. They don't pay him because they're cheap. And so the next night he comes through and, using his magic flute, hypnotizes all the children of the village and pull them into the forest. Again, depending on the telling, either they go into the forest and disappear, or are explicitly drowned in the river like the rats, to punish the cheapskates of the village. So, point being, don't follow the Pied Piper. He's going to kill you. In this case, it's used correctly. The Pied Piper is seen as like, only fools will follow the Pied Piper. They think he's going to lead them to prosperity, but he's leading them to their doom. That sort of thing. I bring this up because we will see this motif later, and in some cases it's not used correctly. But I'll harp on that more later. I noticed, having taught this class multiple times, that they use the Pied Piper a lot. At least in this case, is correct. Where these people are like, oh, he's going to lead us to riches. And the people on the hilltop are like, he's going to drown you guys. All right. So, election of 1896. This was important, again, not because of who actually won, but because of the political ramifications of everything that's happened up to this point. So, the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska. He was a farmer's advocate, favored silver coinage, and the populace, rather than bringing in their own guy, just decided to put their backing behind Bryan, which is fair. It's like, okay, well, we're clearly not going to win, even if we may do better the next time. But this guy is supporting the things we want, so let's just put our votes behind this guy, and we have a better chance of winning. Republicans had William McKinley. He supported the gold standard, higher tariffs on manufactured goods, which, again, would help certain parts of the economy. So Bryan went all around the country doing his campaign, which was the norm. McKinley, however, had his campaign manager, Marcus Alonzo Hanna, basically doing a modern campaign run, which is to say, raised a bunch of money and just sent people and like pamphlets and whatnot, because there wasn't radio or television yet, but like sent information out so that people all around the country could learn about what McKinley was about without him having to go around the country himself and give these big speeches. McKinley beat the brakes off of this man. He won 51% of the popular vote, which at a time when there was more than the two parties that had relatively decent sizes. Again, I've told you guys that once you are old enough to vote and go to vote, it's not just the Democrats and Republicans. There's like 6 more parties beneath them with people running for president that you don't ever hear about because they get like 0.5%. So, but they're there. Back then, they would get more than that, but there was still only really 2 main parties you had to worry about. Which is why winning 51% of the vote was a big deal, because there were all these other parties that were splitting the popular vote. 61% of the electoral vote, which was the first time since Grant that a president won the majority of the popular vote. So again, with these other like 3rd and 4th and 5th parties, while they weren't ever enough to win, they did still pull enough that the top 2 were not quite at half. Anyway, due to how handily McKinley won this, Republicans really were in charge of the government for the next 30 years. And part of that was because the Republicans were able to bring corporate capitalists and their workers together, but also because Cleveland, and therefore the Democratic Party, were blamed for, I shouldn't say necessarily for the Depression, because, I mean, Cleveland didn't go and cause the railroad to fail, but he did make the Depression last longer than it needed to, due to his poor policy decisions. So, the election of 1896 broke the political stalemate. Again, Republicans would have the support of the wage workers and their usual base of businessmen, veterans, and African Americans. So, really, the Democratic Party was curtailed for, again, like the next 30 years. It wouldn't be until Woodrow Wilson we would see another Democrat in the White House. So yeah, again, William McKinley, not super important, relatively speaking. He does start a lot of stuff, but then he gets shot. And the important president comes next, which is to say Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt gets a lot done. But again, McKinley's election isn't super important. It's just that there was such a shift in politics that, again, for 3 decades, the Republicans will be in power. So we have here Bryan and his group. You've got like Silver Syndicate over here. Really just a lot of these groups that were part of the Populists. Here is, nuts, I forgot her name already. Mary Lease? Yeah, Mary Elizabeth Lease, who was, again, part of the founding of the Farmers Alliances that would eventually become the Populists. That's specifically who that is. Versus everybody else. So it did not go well for old Bryan. Again, they're comparing the policies of the Democratic Party to the, how is that pronounced? Lilliput, whatever, the little dudes in Gulliver's Travels that were trying to essentially tie down the government in chaotic and often nonsensical policies. And this one is a horrifying image. You've got William Jennings Bryan's giant face on this populist snake consuming the Democratic Party. What they were seeing essentially was that the Democratic Party was, and it really, Bryan only was acquiescing on like the silver coinage thing, but that was enough for everybody to be like, oh, he's a populist lunatic. and made it seem like the populists were controlling the Democratic Party. I wouldn't say they had that much pull. Yes. Go ahead. Anything specific? Because there's a lot. I'll try. Yeah, just remind me at the end of class, and I'll try to break it down as much as I can. Considering I lived through the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, this is very familiar. This is all the same thing. It's like, oh, we're going in to save the day. It's like, no, we're going to steal oil. And some other things, which I'll get more into at the end of class, because I will get off on it. And we'll get off on a rant. So, no, good question. I will get to that. But, yeah, let's, we're almost done with this chapter. We'll get a little bit into 18, and then we'll discuss. Because, I mean, it is, history exists in patterns, and boy, howdy, we are seeing another pattern that we did, like, literally a few decades ago. So, yeah, I'll get into that. Thank you. Here again we have Puck Magazine. Poor Brian is this little puppet. It says here, Brian is the ablest worker for sound money. The more he talks, the more McKinley wins. And, yeah, McKinley didn't really even have to do much. It seemed like everything Brian said made McKinley seem like the better choice. And so here we have, again, labor and businessmen standing side by side against Brian's campaign. Now, it did get a little weird. There was this other response to that. The Republican Party and the gold standard was crucifying labor. And in the case of freaking Rothschild down here, extremely racist. Yeah, so weird anti-Semitism has been a thing pretty much since the start. I mean, it's been a thing since before America was ever discovered. So this isn't that weird, but Jesus, it's rough to see. Here is just the gold standard and the silver standard. You know, again, that's not super important to me, but clearly it was important back then. So, this in part led to the destruction of the Populist Party. After this election, the Populist Party tore itself apart because it has so many groups within it that had so many different ideas. They were able to kind of go along together for a little while, but after this significant failure in 1896, everyone disagreed on how things should be going forward. A lot of the populist leaders didn't want to emphasize the silver coinage issue because a lot of people in America didn't like that. However, if they dismissed the silver coinage issue, they would lose the support of the silver miners, and apparently that was a pretty big percentage of the populace because they were really hesitant on that. Another issue for the populists was that a lot of the populists had either fought in the Civil War or had relatives who fought in the Civil War on the side of the Union, and they didn't want to work with the Democrats, who they saw as the party of the rebellion, because, I mean, the South was, like, strongly Democrat, and it was the Democratic leaders who pushed for secession. So they felt like they were betraying their people by working with the Democratic Party. Also, though, as the nation pulled out of the Depression, because does eventually just kind of even itself out, it actually weakened the populist position even more. Um, so, industrial workers could not really see eye to eye with farmers because for farmers, the main way for them to make money is to have high crop prices. But if you have high crop prices, that means you have high food prices. And for people living in the cities who could only get food through, the larger manufacturers, they could barely survive anyway. And if food prices went up, it would be untenable for them. So for them to work with a group that would make it harder for them to survive didn't quite work. Also, racism. The populists were unable to maintain a stable biracial coalition. Southern opponents wanted to disenfranchise not just the majority of black voters, but also poor white voters, because again, it's not racism, it's class. But racism just makes it so that the lower class splits themselves apart and makes it harder for them to work together. It's great for the people on top and not for anybody else. Poll tax, literacy test, we talked about that already. Tom Watson, who had once championed for aid for black Americans, returned to bigotry after the 1896 election because clearly that was just the easiest thing for them. Yeah, it's not even the 1900s yet. We're still very much in post-Civil War America. All that said, while the Populist Party did go away, their legacy did not. A lot of their ideas, a lot of their policies would be picked back up by the progressives of the early 20th century, which will be in a couple of chapters. I think it's chapter 19 is the progressive. Yes, chapter 19 is progressivism. And we're going to see all this again. So next chapter, we're not really going to talk about them, but after that, all these ideas are coming back. Direct election of senators, graduated income tax, government regulation of businesses and banking, even a version of their sub-treasury system, the Commodity Credit Corporation, which, sure, I don't know entirely what that does, but great. And it proved to farmers that they could not be independent and survive in the growing industrial world. They have to band together. So while these farmer coalitions didn't create new parties, they did create groups like the Farm Bureau that would lobby to the government on behalf of farmers. So at the least, they had some amount of a voice in the government. So yeah, that's the Populist Party. While they're clearly not still around, their ideas did stick around. So that's the main thing to take from this. And that's it for the chapter. So let me pull up 18 real quick, get a little bit into that, and then we'll discuss other things. So, chapter 18, cities, immigrants, and the nation. So, we're going to be getting into specifically the cities, obviously, and how they were affected by industrialization and the waves of immigration coming in. So, we talked about this at the start of, I don't think last chapter before last. Last chapter. With the shift in, the origin of these immigrants. late 19th century came from northern and western European countries, but then around the turn of the century, there was a shift in where they were coming from. So, for example, 1882, there were about 750,000 immigrants. 87% came from northern and western countries like England, Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia, and significantly less from other parts of Europe. By 1907, however, 81% of the 1.2 million immigrants came from southern and central Europe. Italy, Greece, Austria, Poland, and Russia. I say central, more like Eastern Europe. But point being, there was a shift. Also, after 1880, a lot of these immigrants coming to America were Catholic or Jewish. They often knew very little English because, I mean, obviously, if you've got people coming from England, they're going to know English. And also, if they're coming from England, they're typically going to be Protestant. They were also a part of a cycle of poverty. This is difficult to explain without going into chapters worth of history from my European history course. But to put it as simply as I can, for centuries, these people have been living on the same plot of land as their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, going all the way back to as far back as they had records, basically. I mean, we're talking like 580, maybe, way back. And all they've ever known was you're born on this little plot of land, you work this little plot of land for enough to survive, and then you die. That's all they knew for generations. So coming to America to find your fortune, you know, it's the story of American exceptionalism. We hear it all the time. That was not only a culture shock. They often couldn't speak English, but they didn't have the mindset of go out and find opportunities. It was survive. And the reason they left from where they were is the conditions were getting so bad they literally couldn't survive. So when people come here to America from these countries and they, quote, stay in squalor, we'll just ignore, you know, the American policies that leave them that way, but like, that's all they knew. They didn't have this mindset of, oh, we'll be the next Carnegie. That was, you might as well have told them they were going to move to Mars. Besides just European immigration, there were, of course, migrants from other regions. 450,000 Mexicans migrating north into America between 1860 and 1924. Cubans, Spaniards, and Bahamians moved to Florida to work at cigar factories. And while Chinese immigration remained restricted, Japanese immigration not so much. Due in part to they often didn't compete with white workers when it came to working on railroads and other construction projects. And also the United States kind of, sort of, had to begrudgingly respect them because they had just beat the crap out of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. I'll get a bit more into that in a minute because that is, to me, one of the most interesting conflicts of this period. Now, needless to say, this wasn't like, oh, well, these people are completely different. No, they were still seen as, you know, inferior Orientals, you know, because racism. But they had beat the crap out of Russia, which was seen as, you know, a civilized white race. So that was a whole thing. We'll talk a bit more about that in the next chapter when Teddy Roosevelt is the one that steps in and, like, helps them come to a peace agreement, in part because we didn't want Japan to, like, start taking over Russia. We had to protect our fellow white race. It was a weird time. Well, I say that, but things haven't changed a whole lot. Right. Blatantly stolen from the internet. 1880, 49% from Northwestern Europe. The percentages are a little bit different than what the book gave, but same idea. You've got about half from Northern and Western Europe, and then over here, like 3/4 are from Eastern and Southern Europe. I keep pointing with this, but got to remember I'm online. So yeah, you've got Northern and Western Europe, which is decreases significantly by 1910. What change is evident? Pretty obvious. So we have ships full of people. Obviously, they're all getting up on deck because they're getting into port, so they want to see everything when they get there. They didn't travel across the ocean like this. Here we have a poor immigrant family sitting on the deck. You've got the kids keeping entertained, the dogs there standing guard. Right. This is something that you guys might not have recognized, because I did bring this up a little bit earlier, but this graph gives us a really good indication. Between 1820 and 1985, over the course of about 160 years, this was the percentage of, or this was the number of people coming from other countries into America. By far more Germans than anybody else. That was, 7 million? And the next closest was Italians, which was about 5 million. British, another 5. Irish, 4.5 million. Canadians, about 4 million. Soviet Union, as you can see, this was still pre-fall of the Berlin Wall. 3.5 million. Then we finally have Mexico at about 3 million. 2.9. No, 2.5. I'm sorry, I misread that. So yeah, 2.5 million. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, about 2.5 million, and then just a bunch of other countries this way. We'll mention the Poles, actually. This only has about 500,000. Yeah, so when we talk about immigration from other countries, it's largely been Germans. And you can tell from like the makeup of the nation and a lot of our traditions, and if you ever go into the Midwest, there's people there who still speak German as their first language. Like, that's still a thing. As I mentioned to my other class, most of our, just think of a Christmas tradition, it's probably German. Christmas trees, that's not American. Basically, any kind of decoration, that's all German. German or Austrian, but Austrians are Germanic. Yeah. So that's the whole thing. Here we have some folks having a good time. As I've said, I love images like this where it's just very casual, just kind of a candid picture of people living their lives. It makes it feel much more real than, graphs and statistics and whatnot. Here we have a GIF of a bunch of Polish immigrants. We'll talk a bit about them maintaining their various cultural things, but here we have a family. This is at a Polish church. I don't know what the main denomination in Poland is. But yeah, a lot of these groups to keep them, well, to feed them for one, but also to kind of keep them occupied. We'll go ahead and get ahead of myself. Right. I want to go over this as quickly as I can because otherwise I'll spend the rest of the class on it. China was falling apart. Russia decided that they were going to take Manchuria, and Japan decided that they also wanted this region. So they went to war. The issue with this is that if you're familiar at all with a map, this is the very, very far eastern side of Russia. Most of Russian stuff is in the west, around Moscow and all of that. And between here and there is Siberia. And this was before the Trans-Siberian Railroad was finished. So they couldn't even send people and equipment by rail to the east to fight Japan. Japan took Port Arthur. That was like the first step. Completely wiped out Russia's Pacific Fleet in a single action. and then proceeded to invade Manchuria. Um, there was the Battle of Tsushima, which, if you've got an hour and want to goof around on YouTube, this is worth a watch. It's called, I think, the Disaster of the Baltic Fleet. Basically, Russia, being what it is, needed to hold two fleets, one in the east and one in the west. In the west, that was the Baltic Fleet. After their fleet in the east got destroyed, they were going to send the fleet around the world to fight Japan. They immediately almost went to war with England because they spotted an English fishing boat and thought it was a Japanese submarine in, like, the North Sea, and tried to shoot it, but luckily they were really bad shots and missed every shot, and the English just told them to leave. They also almost started a war with Norway for the same reason. They shot each other a couple of times. The admirals hated each other, so they split the forces. One guy trying to actually lose the other guy. They stopped in Madagascar to refuel, decided to grab a bunch of exotic animals for funsies. Said animals got loose on the ships and started hunting the people in the hallways. Also, lots of fun disease, because, you know, Madagascar tends to be tropical, and Russia not so much. Anyway, they eventually made it to the Pacific and were destroyed in a single battle. That was basically how the rest of the war went. I say all that to say that's how bad Japan beat Russia in this war. Which, again, I'll get more into later, but I've got to bring that up because it's quite interesting to see Russia get beaten so badly. So, back to immigration. The numbers we were looking at actually changed the composition of the U.S. So by 1910, a third of the population was either foreign-born or had at least, had at least one parent who was foreign-born. So that's either they're from another country or they're first-generation immigrants. They were born here, but at least one of their parents is from another nation. And this same demographic made up 3/4 of cities like New York, Detroit, and Chicago, Milwaukee, since Cleveland, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. I always keep thinking the list is shorter than that. Tampa, Miami, and New Orleans was about a third, and regions of Texas, border regions of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California were about the same. So, yeah, that's a significant percentage of people in America being, again, either immigrants or the children of immigrants. Which, to further show you, this is an immigrant nation. So a lot of immigrants did leave their homes for political or religious reasons, which is to say they were going to be killed otherwise. Many did come to the U.S. in search of economic prosperity, because the steamship advertising in Europe would paint America as this land of glittering gold, and you come here and you're like immediately rich. That said, there was a pretty significant percentage of immigrants that returned home. They did achieve some level of economic success and then went back to their home countries. There were 27 million immigrants from 1975 to 1919. About 11 million returned to their nation of origin because they had achieved what they sought to here in America and then left. Obviously, there were groups that went back in much smaller numbers, Jews, Mexicans, Czechs, and Japanese. Many of them were, again, fleeing their nations for political or religious reasons. And by that, I mean they're going to be murdered if they don't. And even those that could return home, or rather, I should say, even those that wanted to return home often couldn't. A Jew trying to go back to Russia, they probably simply wouldn't be able to. Russia was instigating another wave of pogroms and just murdering Jews because. So again, 1910, just lots and lots of Germans. Again, of course, the border region with Mexico, we're going to have most of the Mexican immigrants. Lots of Italians, of course, the Northeast here, Italians and Irish. As I said, I was in Rhode Island, and I spent 4 months in Ireland for my final semester. And then I went to Rhode Island for 2 years for my graduate degree. And Rhode Island almost felt more Irish than Ireland. There are so many people of Irish descent there, and it's really strongly Irish. So again, this more specific percentages than what I just gave you, but same idea. Where the regions are coming from, again, we already talked about that. This gives us slightly different numbers than that thing I pulled up a minute ago. But again, very, very dramatically, mostly Germans. This is 1860 to 1910, so this isn't going past World War I. So we've got images here, folks on, I believe this is a train car. Looks too big to be a bus. Here we have a bunch of children on Ellis Island. This is a surprisingly clear photograph because children, like, this one, tend to move during photography and end up blurs. So most of these kids were standing still. Some of the homes these immigrants were in, well, I say homes, tenements, we'll get more into that later this chapter. Very small, not a lot of room to do much of anything. How many images do I have here for that? If you've ever seen The Godfather, this would look familiar. Just the immigrant markets out on the streets. All right. We are almost caught up with my other class, so let's do that, and then we'll discuss more recent things. So, immigrants processed at the port of arrival. So, wherever they came into the country, they would be processed, registered, and then the government had nothing else to do with them. There was no kind of government assistance for coming into the country to settle. They were just expected to handle things themselves. So in cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago, there were ghettos that cropped up, typically consisting of a single group of an ethnic, racial, or class. Again, specifically, that is the definition of a ghetto, is a neighborhood or a region that is populated by a single group of people. Typically, that's associated more with less economically aided regions here in the United States. But back then, it meant more specifically just where people from, say, Italy were living, or Germany. Now that said, they were still real rough. They were still very poor, many of them living in shacks, which I'll show you guys in a minute. But it did at least mean that they were coming to a place where people spoke the same language. Sometimes they'd even find people from like the same region of the country that they were from. So it helped to a degree. And alongside ghettos, we have mutual aid societies. So these were made to, again, further help immigrants, specifically providing social welfare, insurance payments, and funeral rights. And that seems like an odd example, but the example the book gives us on why one of these mutual aid societies was created. A Jewish association founder explained that a man died in a factory and was left in an unmarked grave. Because you die in a factory, they just toss you in a hole. That's the best you're going to get. No one's told about it. There's no like next of kin. No, there's no funeral. You're just tossed in a hole. That's what you're worth to a company. His neighbors heard about this, dug him up, and gave him a proper burial, and started their organization with the cemetery. Because, especially for groups that were strongly religious, not having a decent burial is kind of a big deal. The Chinese in San Francisco had similar organizations to find jobs, fight anti-Chinese discrimination, sponsoring cultural festivals. Japanese farmers on the West Coast had Kinjinkai, which also had cultural festivals and social activities, which would help, bring the people together, but also they would use these organizations to find jobs for the immigrants, housing, etc. And then you have places like Tampa, Spaniards, Cubans, and Afro-Cubans, and Italians had competing mutual aid societies. We have El Centro Español, El Centro Austriano, that had a large expensive theater. El Circulo Cubano had a pharmacy, a theater, and a ballroom. And La Union Martimacio that had a baseball team. So we go from, this to me is just a great progression of people looking out for each other, where you go from, hey, let's not let our people just be thrown in a hole, to multiple mutual aid societies offering pretty nice stuff to try to get more people to join them. The baseball team is actually, so we'll mention here again in a minute. To explain that, if you've got a group of people, typically young men from another country that are coming in trying to find jobs, but because of racism, lots of places are just turning them away. They're not able to find any work, therefore they're poor, left in squalor, and starving. What are they going to do to try to fix that? What's a group of young, largely, typically uneducated men going to do if they can't get a job and they're starving? They're going to work, they're going to do crime. So, these baseball teams were not just team building exercises, but it would keep these young men off the streets and in these organizations, which again, meant that they wouldn't be on the streets potentially doing crime to survive. But also, if they're in these organizations, they're getting help to find places to work, because the organization is going to have a larger net than just walking the streets and looking for a place to work. That said, living conditions still weren't great. They were living in just literal shacks. Here we have, we'll come to this again a little bit later. Yeah, these rough-looking guys out front here, you didn't want to walk into this neighborhood if you weren't part of this neighborhood, but for the people living here, they were going to keep you safe. So it depends on what side you're looking at that from. Again, the inside of one of these shacks. I mean, this one looks like a prospector's hut out in the west or something. This is not great living, but it's all they can do. It's all they had. Again, we have the modern shops here with all their advertising, and then right across the street are just shacks, people trying to survive. And then there's this awful image of a group of boys, clearly during the winter, sitting over a grate leading into the sewer. Because if you've ever, it doesn't happen a lot around here, but that last cold snap we had, um, you'll see like steam coming out of the storm gutters, because underground is going to stay warmer than the surface when the weather gets cold like this. So they're literally trying to keep their feet from freezing by sitting over this grate leading down into the sewers, and the warmer air coming out. So yeah, not a lot of help for these people. That said, less depressing. These various mutual aid societies were their lifeline. You have Union de Fraternidad, whatever. It's a fraternity, which is to say a brotherhood, not a college fraternity. This is a Italian mutual aid society. Here we have a Hebrew Shelter and Immigrant Association. So again, for Jewish immigrants coming in, a place for them to stop and get food, find jobs, etc. Circolo Stabile, I don't know, again, Italian thing. Here we have the Society for the Protection of Italian Immigrants. Does what it says on the tin. Kinjinkai, these various groups of Japanese immigrants coming together and maintaining their cultural heritage, while also helping each other find jobs and whatnot. And these haven't gone away. There are still, to a degree, Kinjinkai. Here we have George Takei and some other prominent Asian Americans at what was essentially Kinjinkai in California. We'll talk more about Mr. Takei a little bit later, because he was alive and remembers the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. So that's specifically why I'm bringing him up here. All right, let's do one more, and then we will be where I want to be. So, besides neighborhoods of people from the same region, these various civic associations, churches and synagogues also will provide religious and social activities for people, because, again, they were largely from like Jewish or Catholic countries where religion is not just like a thing you do on a Sunday, it's your whole culture. For example, Catholic churches more than tripled from 3,000 to 10,000 between 1965 and 1900. And it was a place that you could go for births, baptisms, weddings, and deaths that were far warmer and more personal than just going to a city clerk and signing a piece of paper. And I do include deaths here because if you've ever been to a Catholic wake, it's typically, it's somber to a degree, but the Catholics really emphasize the celebrate the person's life aspect of a funeral. So yeah, this would be the place to go if a loved one died, rather than just like going to a clerk and signing a piece of paper and throwing them in a hole. The Catholic Church, with the problems that they've got, they certainly knew how to celebrate important parts of people's lives. Churches would offer food and clothing to those that were ill or unable to work. They would also field sports teams, so same thing. And also the number of immigrants coming from Europe actually changed how religion was practiced here in the U.S., at least to some degree. For example, within Catholicism, there is like the canon saints. But depending on what country you're from, you might have like local saints, or in this case, protectresses, as it mentions, that were not part canon of Catholicism, but were just as much a part of your personal regional religion as the rest of Catholicism. So a lot of American Catholics saw this as pagan, which is, I don't know, a weird label to use, but sure. Again, with the Jews, there was a shift in religious adherence. German Jews that had arrived a few generations before had largely integrated, achieved economic success, and founded Reform Judaism. And as I mentioned in my other class, this is the weirdest thing I probably will ever say in American history, with Cincinnati, Ohio as the center. Cincinnati, Ohio is where Reform Judaism came from. That's weird. To think of Cincinnati, Ohio as really much of anything. Relaxed standards of worship. Prayers could be said in English. Relaxing of dietary laws, so they weren't necessarily forced to only eat kosher. Meanwhile, Eastern European Jews who came from nations that were, again, more rooted in the old ways, continued to go to shul, which is Hebrew for synagogue, maintained kosher, and prayed in Hebrew, and often spoke Hebrew as like their first language, which isn't a common language, relatively speaking. If you've never been to a Catholic church, they're big. They're big, they're ornate. They're a different experience than what you might think of with a Protestant church like this, which typically is much smaller and more simple, which was like a whole point of the Protestant Reformation. I think I've also got, yes, I really like this image as well. This is I believe an Irish regiment during the Civil War having Mass. It's Sunday. They've got the priest. They set up a little altar here because there's a lot of pomp and circumstance to Catholicism, and they're having Mass out in the middle of a field. That said, not everybody was on board with this, and a lot of Catholic churches got burned down because they were seen as a threat to the Protestant authority or whatever. We'll get more into that later. And then we have, confirmation for a little Jewish boy, which is a common image for this. But that said, here we go. Those from Eastern Europe were almost like a completely different religion by the time it's compared to Reform Judaism. So it was a shift. It was a bit of a culture clash. All right, I think that's it. Yeah. So next is literacy and crime. We'll talk about that next time. So real quick, about modern stuff. The invasion of Iran is no different than our invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. How many years ago has that been now? 15, 20? 20. It was early 2000s. Jesus. It's framed in we're going in to overthrow their evil regime and put somebody good in charge. That never happened in Iraq. It never happened in Afghanistan. We've done that for decades. We're not really going to be able to get too much into the Cold War, but that's mostly what we did during the Cold War was like if there was a country that seemed too communist, we would just go in and murder their leader and set up our own guy, even if that other guy was like basically a Nazi, because there were a lot of like Nazis that had fled to Central and South America, and they were more than happy to be in charge of the country. That's why Central and South America is in such rough shape, because of us. The thing with Iran, Iraq, the whole Middle East, oil, obviously. That's part of why gas prices have shot up, because we are causing conflict in a region where most of our oil comes from. But also, there's this weird thing, and we'll talk about this group a little bit later, and I can speak on some authority about this because this is how I was raised. There is a group of American Christians who believe that conflict in the Middle East will cause the rapture to happen faster. That's a whole thing. That's literally part of national policy now, which is terrifying, that we're trying to cause the end of the world by invading countries. That's literally a thing. And like I said, I was raised in that. That's not some hyperbolic, oh, people are just being anti-Christian. That's being realistic. And that's not all Christianity, obviously. There's a lot of different groups of Christians, and this is like a small group, but they're in power in the United States right now. I mean, this was the same group that the George Bush talked about this. Yes. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah. They don't have the capability to hit us. Um, and if they did, we have a lot of safeguards against that. I wouldn't say 100%. There's no 100% in war. But other countries are going to suffer because of this. Our economy is going to tank again. Um, Lots of young men and women are going to get sent off to war to die for oil, with the promises of you get to come back and have free college and get VA for the rest of your life, and even those that make it back don't get that. I know a lot of veterans, and the VA doesn't help. Um, yeah, we're not going to, I mean, there's not going to be Iranian troops here in America for sure. I don't see us actually getting hit by anything because those missiles got to go a long ways. But we're going to lose a lot of servicemen. A lot of servicemen and women are going to die because of a war of greed. And one could definitely argue avoiding certain things that are happening here in America. Let's avoid certain revelations that would get a lot of our politicians in jail. Let's put that aside. Look, we're doing a war. We can't worry about that. It's illegal. Yeah. You the the people right. So the only way you can declare war is through Congress. The last time we declared war was World War II. But no one holds the people in power in account anymore because those who have power to actually do anything are also complicit. They're also a part of it. So, like, Congress could demand that all this be reversed, that the executive branch be prosecuted, but they're not going to because they're all spineless and working with the executive branch. And the judicial branch is also full of its cronies. So, like, nothing's going to get done because all the people who have the levers of power are working together, or at least not doing anything because it's in their best interest. Depends on where you go. Apparently, my IT guy Brent, he and his family went on a Caribbean cruise, and they didn't go. They didn't go to their stop at Cozumel because there was an alert from the U.S. Embassy there because of all of this. Not to say that there was, Iranian troops in Cozumel or anything, but, like, it's going to cause issues. Would it be safe? I would say 99% probably, but you never know. I mean, there's people in the Middle East right now, Americans in the Middle East, that are trapped. And the U.S. government has told them they can't do anything about it. So, yeah, it's a scary time. But I mean, like I said, I've lived through it. It happens. Unfortunately, the people in power are corrupt and greedy and throw away lives. We're in Iran. We've been in Iraq for like 25 years. We're attacking Iran right now. Yeah. No, we our military is the size of like the next 15 put together. That's China, Russia, Great Britain, France, Germany, all these countries that wouldn't actually work together would have to work together just to equal us because we spend so much on our military. Most of our national budget goes into the military. That's why our roads are crap. That's why our education's in bad shape. That's why our health care will just kill you because most of our money is going into the military. So we're safe there, but yeah, there's not enough countries willing to fight us that would be enough of a threat to people just here in America. Mhm. Right. I'm not sure. Yeah. I don't know. Supposedly, we destroyed their nuclear program like a year ago, but now that's why we're there. Granted, we went to Iraq for weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, and we knew they didn't exist, but that was the excuse. So, um, yeah, I'd say it's less of an issue for us and more of an issue for like the image of America globally, and how many people are going to die for this. So, yeah. Uh, I don't know. Apparently, we're doing it because Israel wanted us to, and they're real good about not doing war crimes. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess the overall goal would be regime change there, getting oil for cheaper. It's always follow the money. Not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but all right, I'll see y'all next week.